English classroom, in history classroom? How does it compare to close reading? So let's take a look and let's close read this passage together. The buzz in the street was like the humming of flies. Photographers stood massed behind barriers patrolled by police, their long-snouted cameras poised, their breath rising like steam. Snow fell steadily onto hats and shoulders, gloved fingers wiped lenses clear. So if we were going to take a traditional approach to this, we might pay attention to language choices and how they make us feel, right? So things like metaphor, allegory, simile, all of these different types of literary and rhetorical devices. We might notice, for example, that in this passage, there's kind of an embodied perspective. We get the feeling that we're there because we're not only being presented with what things look like, but how things sound and what things feel like, right, through the use of language. So what would it be like if we were going to distant read this passage? We would focus on a different set of things. We would focus on word frequency, maybe. And we might focus on the frequency of words that we as humans don't really pay attention to or don't really notice. So words like the, and, or, words that aren't really interesting, don't have a lot of meaning, right? But a computer is very good at counting those types of words and at determining their frequency. But what would that get us? What would be the point of doing that, right? Why do we care that the appears 2,000 times in this book? Does anyone recognize the passage? So this is the opening paragraph from The Cuckoo's Calling, okay? So The Cuckoo's Calling was published under a pseudonym. It was published under the pseudonym Robert Galbraith, but it was actually written by J.K. Rowling, the person who wrote the Harry Potter series. Any Harry Potter fans in the audience? Yeah, okay. So counting those words, like the, and, or, in, that's actually how a group of computer scientists and journalists figured out that the same person who wrote Harry Potter also wrote The Cuckoo's Calling. They distant read The Cuckoo's Calling, looking at the distribution of words like the and realized that, hey, this is the same person who wrote Harry Potter. And the reason they were able to do that is that the frequency of those types of words, even though they don't seem important, function like a fingerprint. Each author uses words like the, and, or, and these are called high-frequency function words, uses them in a different distribution, so everyone uses them subconsciously a little bit differently. So they provide a signal that's unique to each individual author. So using a computer allowed these scientists to figure out that the same signal in The Cuckoo's Calling was the Harry Potter signal. Okay, so distance reading is so great if it can let us figure out what J.K. Rowling is doing in her spare time. Why might there be critiques of it? Why might some people be pushing back against it? I'm going to start to talk about that now. So on the one hand, it's a good thing because it lets us kind of look at a lot of texts. It lets us ask historical questions. It's very broad in focus, right? But along with that, there are some negative things. One way to think about this is kind of in terms of this metaphor of looking from a distance versus looking up close. So we can think of distant reading as like looking at a city's power grid from an airplane. I don't know if people have done this before when you're flying. I always really enjoy looking down, especially if it's nighttime, and seeing the power grid at night, right? So when we do that, we can see patterns. We can see neighborhoods that don't have as many lights. We can see the city center because it's probably the brightest area, right? So we can make these kind of assumptions based on that big picture. But we don't get a sense of the people walking the city streets. We don't get a sense of the signage, of the stores, of what's going on at eye level. So distant reading is like that looking down from a plane. We can see patterns, but we can't see individual complexity or nuance. Close reading is like when we're actually in the city and we're seeing what's going around us. We don't get that big picture of maybe where the city ends or how large it is, but we know what's going on in our immediate vicinity. So these are just a couple of opinions that scholars and critics have voiced about distant reading. Computational methods are mainly useful at larger scales of analysis, which we sort of talked about. Literature cannot meaningfully be treated as data. So that starts to get us towards the critique, right? This idea that the words in literature, the things that are in art, cannot be reducible to the types of information that we study in STEM, that we study in computer science, right? That there's a difference here. No computer program weeps when it reads the passages in Felix Sultan's Bambi in which Bambi's mother dies. Okay, this is a very common critique. This is the critique that as humans, when we read, we feel things, we notice things, there's emotion, there's complexity, there's nuance, and that computers are bad at that. And to some extent, this is true. Computers do not read the same way that people do. But it's also a little bit of an oversimplification. Okay, so as I move into talking about these two case studies, these two large examples of how to use distant reading in your work, I have a question that I'd kind of like everyone to keep in the back of their mind. And this question is, can distant reading guide us toward better close reading? So typically, these two methods are thought of as opposites, as antithetical. You're either in the close reading camp or you're in the distant reading camp. But I'd like to kind of propose that these two things can actually be used together in a symbiotic relationship, that we can bring distant reading into the traditional English classroom, and that we can bring close reading into the STEM fields to make distant reading even stronger. Okay, case study 1. So as I mentioned, this study pertains to looking at the correlation between gender and action. The basic question here is, do male and female characters behave differently in the 19th century novel? And if they do, why? What can that tell us? And how do they behave differently? What are all of these male characters up to? What are all of these female characters up to, right? Okay, so the basic method here, it started with a pretty large corpus. It's not hundreds of thousands of novels, but it's more than I certainly have read in my lifetime and probably ever will read. So it's a corpus of 3,329 19th century novels. These are predominantly Anglophone, so they're mostly American, British, Irish, and Scottish. The gender breakdown in terms of authorship is about 60% male authored and 40% female authored. So action in itself is kind of difficult to detect, right? When we talk about a character doing something, the way we interpret that character's action depends on the character's motivation. It depends on the way that action's described. There's a lot of nuance involved. But in terms of getting a computer to look at action, we need to reduce it to more of a common denominator. So verbs in this study are the stand-in for action. So basically, we're looking at gender through looking at gendered pronouns, because this is in English, we have gendered pronouns. So she, he, her, his, and looking at the verbs that those pronouns perform in the 19th century. Okay, so we used a tool, and this was a group project. The other project I'll talk about is just mine, but this was a group project. We used a tool called the Stanford Dependency Parser, and this is freely available online if anyone wants to play with it. You can download it and run it through Terminal. You can download it and run it through various scripting environments if you're a little tech savvy, but it's freely accessible. So the Stanford Dependency Parser is essentially a tool that lets you look at grammatical relationships. So let's take the sentence, she watched as her dog ate. So if we parse that sentence, the parser is going to know that the verb watched is performed by the gendered pronoun she. Now the cool thing about this is that the parser will get it right even if we put words in between she and watched. So if she anxiously watched as her dog ate, the parser will still know that watched belongs with she. And if we have multiple verbs, if she anxiously watched and listened, the parser is going to know that both of those verbs go with she, right? And this is just an example of what the output from the parser looks like. It's not super important to get all the details here, but you can kind of see that it's grouping words. And in that first grouping, we have watched linked with she. Okay, so this is when it starts to get a little bit more fun. So after dependency parsing, we essentially have all of the gendered pronouns and all of the things that they do in over 3,000 19th century novels. And we can kind of put that in a big spreadsheet, essentially. So we have a column with the gendered pronouns and a column with all the verbs that they're performing. We can then link that up with a bunch of metadata. Metadata is essentially information about a text. So things like the author's gender, the year of publication, the nationality of publication, the genre of the piece, right? Whether it's a gothic novel or a romance novel, things like that. So by linking all of that information with the gendered pronoun information and the verb information, we're able to ask more nuanced questions like, do male characters act differently in a gothic novel than they would in a romance novel? What about if it's authored by a female author instead of a male author, right? So we get a little bit more nuance. The really fun part, though, is performing a classification experiment. Is there anyone here from CS or from engineering or anything like that? Okay, one person. Okay, so a classification experiment is essentially training a model, getting the computer to make a guess, to make an educated guess. So essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to train a computer model to guess the gender of a character based only on the actions that character is performing. So if we give the computer a sentence like blank walked, we want the computer to be able to guess the gender of blank based on the fact that walked is the verb being performed. So before I start talking about the results and some of the findings from the study, I want to kind of pause to talk about the limitations and to be transparent about what this is and is not doing. So we're only measuring one aspect of characterization, right? You can't reduce a character only to what they're doing, right? I mean, if we have the example, he timidly answered the question, and he confidently answered the question. Those are two very different moments, and we get a different impression of that character based on the use of an adverb. But we're not looking at adverbs. And for the computer's sake, it would count both of these sentences as the same thing, because we're only looking at he and answered. So we're removing some nuance there. We're also not accounting for irony, or parody, or humor. So if you think about the presentation of gender stereotypes, which is really what's at the heart of this study, we're interested in the gender stereotypes that are present in the 19th century. Someone sincerely putting forward a gender stereotype is going to look to a computer really similar to someone parodying a gender stereotype. And they're going to be almost indistinguishable. So we're not really accounting for that here. We're also not really accounting for whether or not a character is good or bad. We're not distinguishing between characters. If a negative female character performs an action, the computer is going to think of it in the same way as a positive female character performing an action, even though we as humans know that there's a big judgment call in between those two things. We would interpret it differently, right? Okay. All right. So I'd like everybody to take a look at these sentences. I've removed the gendered pronoun. So blank heard what they said, blank took the package, blank looked at the scene, blank muttered quietly. So take a minute, if you want to turn to someone next to you, you're welcome to, or you can just quietly do it in your head. I'd like you to take a guess. I'd like you to pretend to be the computer here, and I'd like you to guess which sentences are which actions are being performed by a female pronoun, and which actions are being performed by a male pronoun. So take a second, and try and think of all four. Okay, everybody have your guess?
I'm going to go with they.
So it turns out that in the 19th century novel, female characters are doing most of the hearing. Male characters are doing most of the taking. Female characters are doing most of the looking. And male characters are doing most of the muttering. Who got them all right? Okay, all right. Anyone want to take a guess as to how often the computer is able to get this right?
85%?
Pretty good guesses. Okay. The machine is able, and this is only on the verb, not on the adverb, not on any adjectives. The machine is able to correctly guess the gender of the pronoun 82% of the time. So, on the one hand, this is somewhat predictable, right? It's the 19th century. Gender roles are pretty constricting. Gender stereotypes are pretty prevalent. But I also think it's kind of startling and disheartening, right? The extent to which the computer can guess based only on the verb, right? It's kind of shocking to see that. So these verbs that I've presented right here are, in addition to telling us when it can guess, how confident it is when it's guessing, it also tells us which verbs are the most gendered. And these are the 10 most gendered verbs in the 19th century novel. If there's a plus sign in the column, it indicates that it's associated with that gender. So wept is associated with female characters. Sat is strongly associated with female. You would think everyone would be sitting kind of equally, right? Sat is strongly associated with female characters. Rode is strongly associated with male characters. One of the ones that I find most surprising is muttered is strongly male, but murmured is strongly female. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, but it's also a little surprising. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the 19th century and how these results fit into what we know about the 19th century. So this is a quote by Barbara Welter. Men in the 19th century were supposed to be religious, although they rarely had time for it, and supposed to be pure, although it came awfully hard to them. But men were the movers, the doers, the actors. Women were the passive, submissive responders. So anyone who's familiar with the concept of the angel in the house, or the separation of spheres into the domestic and public sphere, this kind of goes right along with that line of stereotypes, right? We can even see in this image from the 19th century that the man is positioned next to a doorway. He's literally arriving from the outside world, presumably where he was doing something, returning to the domestic sphere, which is the realm of his wife, right? So the results somewhat correspond with this. Verbs that we might associate with physical action, like riding and walking and running, are strongly associated with male characters, while verbs associated more with emotion, like weeping or loving or blushing, are more strongly associated with female characters. There are a couple of unexpected results, and this one's a little tricky, so you might need to read the slide twice, and I can certainly come back to it. So most of the time the machine was right, but when it was wrong, when the machine guessed incorrectly, it was more likely to be wrong when the pronoun was female. And this is counterintuitive for me. I expected it to be the opposite. So we could interpret this result as indicating that there is less variation when it comes to verbs associated with male characters. We can also interpret it as suggesting that the verbs most indicative of female pronouns are less stable, are somehow more fluid than those associated with male characters. And again, this is a somewhat counterintuitive result. Okay. Another surprising result, and one that I think is the most fun, has to do with outliers. And I'm going to be returning to the idea of outliers a couple of times. So outliers in data analytics are essentially the aspects of our data that don't fit into the trend, that buck the trend, that don't go along with what everyone else is doing. So there were lots of novels in which the machine incorrectly guessed what male characters were up to, or what female characters were up to. But there were only 9 novels in the corpus of 3,329 in which both genders of characters were guessed incorrectly. So this is pretty surprising. We might expect to see a lot more novels kind of gone awry. I've listed the 9 novels here, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about these novels because I've kind of close read and worked on some of them in more depth. But one thing that I do want to point out is that some of these we're all familiar with. Everybody's probably heard of Jane Eyre. It's one of the most famous novels in the English language. So it's very canonical, very popular. I had never heard of Klosterheim before. I had never heard of A Brilliant Woman before. There's a lot of out-of-print material here. Some of these, like A Brilliant Woman, were actually very popular in the 19th century. It was a bestseller, but it's like gone out of print. This is a pretty much forgotten novel. So one of the kind of cool, useful things about this analysis is that it's telling us there's something similar and something rare about this group of books, some of which are canonical, some of which we all focus on, pay attention to, and some of which no one has ever heard of, right, at this point. So it's letting us make a comparison between canonical and non-canonical texts. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about outliers, I'm going to read a passage from A Brilliant Woman. So it's tempting to think that an outlier would somehow be more progressive, somehow in bucking the trend, right? We would assume that it's breaking down gender stereotypes, and that it's challenging those stereotypes, and that it's a progressive text. That's the temptation. That's how it's tempting to read the outliers in this case. But that's not entirely true. So in A Brilliant Woman, the novel focuses on a married couple, Maria and her husband, and they're unhappily married. And they're in part unhappily married because neither of them is willing to conform to 19th century gender roles. It jarred not a little upon Maria's cousin to hear the open way in which Maria expressed her intention of managing her husband, Mr. Burlington. I do not think you quite understand Mr. Burlington, my dear. He is not a character that will brook management. My dear cousin, he will know nothing about it. I mean to make him do always and at all times exactly what I wish without his being aware of it. It is one of the attractions. I intend pushing him into action, rousing his ambition. You will see. Of course, To succeed in anything, one must know and understand everything. But I am not afraid. I do not think the task quite beyond myself. So Maria is very confident, but Maria is not portrayed in a positive light, right? So even though she's doing things like making her husband act, and that implies that her husband doesn't want to act, right? It implies that he is a more passive character. Even though she's pushing and making and doing, this isn't portrayed in a good way, right? This is an example of the 19th century sort of bad wife, according to the author, Chet Wind. So even though this is an outlier, it's not necessarily a progressive text. Okay, so two kind of important conclusions to take away from this. There is a strong correlation between gender and action in the 19th century, depressingly so, and if anyone's feeling depressed about that correlation, I will offer up the fact that there's been some research after I did this study by other scholars who have found that it does get better in the 20th century. So yeah, a little bit. So if you start looking at books between 1900 and 1950, the computer is less able to guess. So there's a little bit more fluidity in terms of the actions that different gender characters are performing. It would be interesting to see if that holds true or continues to get better in the 21st century, but because of things like copyright, it's very difficult to look at contemporary books. So even though some of the results are expected, the method suggests additional avenues of study by pointing our attention to these outliers, by pointing our attention to books we might not normally read, and we might not normally read together. I don't think there are any other studies that look at Jane Eyre next to A Brilliant Woman, right? So it kind of gives us these interesting juxtapositions. Okay, I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I will start talking about the second project. You can entertain yourselves by reading the cartoon.
I forgot Ziggy existed.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, this is also a distant reading study. It's also a study that's invested in gender in some respects, but it's about reader address. Any fans of A Series of Unfortunate Events, either on Netflix or, okay. I got into this project because I enjoyed A Series of Unfortunate Events and books like that so much as a kid. Those books, for those of you who aren't familiar, typically start off with the author saying, if you like happy books, this isn't for you. You probably don't want to read this. You should probably just put this away. Go find a different book to read, right? House of Leaves, if anyone has read it, starts out similarly. The epigraph is, this is not for you, right? An interesting way to start a book. So these moments where authors or narrators speak directly to us are really interesting to me because typically we get sucked into fiction. Typically we get to pretend that we're experiencing the things along with the characters. We're pretending that the fiction is real. But in this case, instead of going into the fiction, someone in the fiction is reaching out to us into the real world, right, to talk to us as a reader. And that's pretty interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what exactly reader address is. You know it when you see it, right? But vocative formulations that identify the reader directly, you and dear reader are the most common form. Address and narrative is interpreted as a strategy to get the reader more involved. So when we think of address, especially scholars who are working in English, there are two types of address that often come up. Let's look at the first example. This is from Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Relax. Concentrate. Okay? So it's kind of what I was just talking about with the series of unfortunate events. It's playful, it's ironic, it's funny, it's postmodern, it's metafictional, right? It's all of these things. The second example is very different. Reader, I married him. A quiet wedding we had, he and I. The parson and the clerk were alone present. And this is perhaps the most famous example of reader address in the English language. This is from Jane Eyre, which we've already talked about a little bit. So this isn't really playful. It's not metafictional, it's not ironic, it's kind of sincere. We might associate it with sentimentality, with the Victorian tradition. The whole idea of the dear reader is something we associate with the Victorian novel. So very different in terms of their affect. So why are these moments so interesting? One of the cool things about address is that it often tells us something about the implied reader. The implied reader is who the author thinks they're writing for. So if we look at this example from Ruth Hall, It was in a delicate, beautiful female hand, just such a one as you, dear reader, might trace, whose sweet, soft eyes and long, drooping tresses are now bending over this page. It lets us know that she was envisioning a female reader, that she thought that her book was primarily going to be read or enjoyed by a female audience, right? And oftentimes in these moments of address, authors tell us something about what they think their reader's political affiliation is, what they think the reader's religious affiliation might be, their ethnic identity. All of these different factors kind of come up in moments of address. The other reason that address is so interesting is because it's so emotional. It's intended to further an emotional effect. So we just saw some instances in which the intended effect is humor. It's supposed to kind of make us chuckle, right? But sometimes it's supposed to make us feel sympathy for a character. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we'll talk about in a minute, is filled with address, in which she begs the reader to feel sympathy for the characters, sympathy for enslaved individuals. Guilt and fear are also emotions that get furthered in moments of address quite frequently, especially in more recent novels. Okay, so there's not a ton of work on address. And one of the reasons for this is that address is associated with sort of lowbrow art, lowbrow fiction. It's associated with advertising, it's associated with genre fiction, kind of not art, right, with Victorian sentimentality, all these things that are kind of ignored and frowned upon. But despite that, there have been a couple of scholars who have looked at address. And I want to talk about kind of the two main ideas that get spouted in terms of address. The first has to do with time, what people think the timeline of address looks like. Address was a familiar feature of the early novel, but by the beginning of the 20th century, the reader was much more likely to be largely ignored. In postmodern fiction, direct address and characterization of the reader may be said to reappear. So this is the common consensus, that address becomes really popular in the 18th century with the kind of advent of the epistolary tradition, then becomes even more popular in the 19th century with the rise of the novel and with Victorian sentimentality, then disappears with modernism at the beginning of the 20th century, and resurrects itself with postmodernism towards the end of the 20th century. And we see it again. It's very popular in children's literature right now. Okay. So in terms of gender, there's been some interesting speculation about how address works. Robin Warhol, who's a feminist narratologist and rhetorician, kind of argues that in the 19th century, male and female authors use address in different ways. She argues that female authors, who are writing from a disenfranchised position in the 19th century, used address sincerely, that they're talking to real readers, and they're talking to them about important social causes, like abolition, like immigration, like the workforce, and that they're trying to elicit sympathy on behalf of other disenfranchised individuals. She argues that male authors, on the other hand, are more likely to use this kind of playful, ironic, humorous, metafictional form of address. What's interesting about Warhol's argument is that it's really easy to study it from a computational perspective because she links different words with these two different rhetorical approaches. She says that female authors are more likely to use the word you because you is intimate, it's engaging, it makes us feel a personal connection. She argues that male authors are more likely to use the word reader, which is kind of distancing, more likely to be ironic, more likely to be playful. So obviously this is a very testable hypothesis, which gets me very excited. Okay, so my main questions then are, how does the frequency of address actually change over time? How do male and female authors use address differently? And how might we factor African American authorship into this equation? Warhol is talking about writing from a disenfranchised position. So we might see how her argument maps onto other disenfranchised groups in the 19th century. Are African American authors who are also writing about important social causes, employing similar forms of address and to similar effects? But unfortunately, in order to examine these three questions, there's another important question that happens first. So all of these questions are kind of broad, right? They're dealing with large questions about a lot of texts, about trends and patterns. In order to answer those three questions, we need to figure out how we can detect and measure address across a large corpus. How can we train a computer to know when address is actually happening? And it turns out it's kind of hard. So it's difficult for a computer to know when address is happening. We can't use the classification models that we used in the last project. We can't use the prediction models that we used. We can't talk about confidence or any of those things. And the reason for that is that syntactically, address looks like not address. So if we have "you must go on" in quotation marks, it's character dialogue, right? We have a character telling another character, "you must go on." If we have "you must go on" outside of quotation marks, that "you" might refer to us. It might be a character speaking to the actual reader. The only difference here is not a difference in terms of syntax. The only difference is the use of quotation marks. So that suggests a potential answer to the problem. Maybe the existence of certain keywords, like "dear reader," like "you," outside of quotation marks, might let us know when address is actually happening. So we solved the problem, but we didn't. Because it turns out it's really, really difficult to get rid of quotations in literature. This is a problem that plagues computer scientists and people working in the digital humanities, people working in linguistics. You would think it would be easy to get rid of all of the quotations and then just focus on the narration. But it turns out that in most cases, quotations are really messy. So these are some of the most common mistakes that are made in texts. So our first quote, "Oh, it's not that, sir," that looks good. As an opening curly quote, end curly quote, everything looks fine. The second one is missing its end curly quote mark. And this is actually very common. In the second paragraph, things get a little tricky because we have an embedded quote. The word "Floyd" is inside another quotation. And we also have a quotation that extends across paragraphs, which makes things a little difficult. Finally, in that last paragraph, we have the opposite problem of the first one. We have a missing start quotation mark. And all of these things are very common. You'd think people would have been a little bit more careful and a little neater in the 19th century, but they were not. All right, because this is kind of the most computationally difficult part of either of the projects I'm going to talk about, I'm going to walk through it step by step. So this is kind of the meat of it. This is the beef, computationally, for people working on these types of problems. It's figuring out how to train a computer to find these sort of things. So this is the method that I developed. So essentially, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the easy stuff. We're going to take care of all of those quotations that aren't missing anything, that aren't embedded, that don't have any quotes within quotes. So we're going to get rid of the first one, and then we're going to get rid of Floyd. Then we're going to do something unusual. We're going to slap all of our text together in one giant super paragraph. So we're going to get rid of those paragraph breaks, and this allows us to get rid of that quotation that was extending across paragraphs, because now everything's nice and neat. Then we're going to re-put it into its original paragraph structure. And at this point, what we're going to do is artificially add an end quotation mark to every single paragraph. This allows us to get rid of any quotations that are missing an end quote, but notice it doesn't mess up the other paragraphs. It doesn't do anything that we've added an end quote there, because there's no start quote, so it's not a problem. We can then go ahead and get rid of those end quotes that we've artificially added, and do the same thing but at the other end. We can artificially add a start quote, which doesn't mess anything up. It just allows us to get rid of that quotation that was missing a start quote mark. That leaves us with the narration, which is what we wanted, all of the material that's not dialogue. We can then look for those keywords like "dear reader" within that narration and come up with "his smile, dear reader, was beaming." So we now have our moment of address. It seems simple. It was not. It took a large portion of my life to figure this out. This is my dissertation. So there was a long period in which I was just mumbling crazy things about quotation marks in my sleep. Okay. So a little bit more about the method. We're looking at less texts. We're only looking at 2,000 here for various reasons, but again, it's still more than I could personally read. These are texts written between 1789 and 1923, slightly water swath of time. We want to look at modernism. We want to look at the end of the century. 70% male authored, 30% female authored, 70% American authored, 30% British. There are a few unknown genders and unknown nationalities here. It's such a small amount that I just sort of statistically removed that. It's a very small part of the corpus. Okay, so just like we did with the last project, let's take a moment to pause and talk about what's wrong with this picture, what the limitations are, what's broken here. So not all forms forms of address are actually being measured. We're getting instances in which the reader is referred to as reader, in which the reader is referred to you, but what if the narrator refers to me as my dear friend, right, or some other set of words? We're not getting that. It's simply not part of this equation. So we're getting some address, but we're not getting all address. This isn't the comprehensive picture. I tested this method on a 30-novel test corpus of novels that I was familiar with that I had actually read as a human being, right? And it did pretty well. It did pretty good. It returned, I think, about 4,000 instances of address, which is a lot. And it turned out that 81% of that was actually address. Some of it was stuff that should have been in quote marks but was never put in quote marks, was put in italics instead. Some of it came from embedded letters or embedded postcards or things of that nature. But the bulk of it, 81% of it, was actually address. It's important to note, though, that as a human being with a limited amount of time, I was not able to do this type of hand-checking on the 2000 novel corpus. The 2000 novel corpus produced over 60,000 instances of address. I read a lot of them, but not all of them, right? It's impossible to hand test some of this information. Finally, with both of these projects, I just want to reiterate, when we talk about a large corpus, we tend to think, oh, somehow it's objective, right? Somehow it's more fair, it's more balanced, but it's not. There are a lot of limitations with these corpora. For example, the fact that they're predominantly male-authored as opposed to female-authored, right? It's not an even distribution. Okay, so general conclusions. Address is surprisingly prevalent. 1,864 of the 2,000 novels contained at least one instance of reader address. The average number of sentences per novel containing address is 49. So that means that on average, each novel addresses you, the reader, 49 times, which is kind of surprising. Some interesting conclusions about time. It turns out that everyone's been wrong. It doesn't actually disappear at the beginning of the 20th century. It never really goes away. So if we look at this graph, well, not graph, if we look at these tables, I'll kind of explain how this information works. So that first column, all novels, it shows the average number of address per novel over 3 time chunks. And from that, it does look like things are decreasing, right? We go from 98 to 45 to 31. So address is becoming less frequent, but it certainly doesn't disappear. But what happens if we get rid of the outliers? Let's go back to that idea of outliers. If we get rid of all of the texts that use address an absurd amount of time, like 2,000 times per novel, and we get rid of all of the address that only happens once or twice, and we just look at what most people are doing. If we do that, if we just look what the crowd is doing, what most authors are doing, it turns out address doesn't really dip at all. It goes from 35 on average to 35 on average to 34 on average. So most authors are using address consistently over time, even at the turn of the century. What does change is the word reader becomes super unpopular, and the word you becomes very popular. And we'll talk about why. But why? So this first example is from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a very addressy novel. There are 92 instances of address in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mothers of America, you who have learned by the cradles of your own children to love, I beseech you, pity the mother who has all of your affections and not one legal right to protect, guide, or educate the child of her bosom. So Stowe is using address to get the reader to feel sympathy for the enslaved population, right? We're not supposed to necessarily be feeling with these characters. It's pity, right? It's sympathy. It's feeling for. Let's look at the second quote. This is from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is also concerned with a social issue, but in this case, it's the poor treatment of immigrant workers in a Chicago meatpacking town. Nicholas is a beef boner, and that is a dangerous trade. Your hands are slippery, and your knife is slippery, and you are toiling like mad when somebody happens to speak to you or you strike a bone. Then your hand slips on the blade, and there is a fearful gash. So even though Stowe and Sinclair are trying to do similar things here, they do it in a very different way. Stowe gets us to feel for a character, but Sinclair gets us to feel with a character. This is about empathy. This is about being in that character's shoes, right? Seeing from their perspective. It's in the second person. Your hands are slippery and your knife is slippery. This, I think, is what's happening. This is why we see you become more popular and reader address actually stick around, because it's becoming these kind of brief dips into the second person perspective, and that's about fostering empathy. That's about getting your reader to feel with, to be in the shoes of your character, instead of getting your reader to feel pity for a character. Okay, talk about gender really briefly. Robin Warhol was right. Female authors are more likely to use you than male authors are. Male authors are more likely to use reader. Interestingly, though, this doesn't hold true for African American authors. African American authors use the term reader relatively more frequently than their contemporaries. And this kind of goes against what my initial hypothesis was. If Warhol thinks that using you is tied to furthering social causes, I would have expected to see 19th century African American authors, certainly not all of whom were writing about social causes, but many of them were. I would expect them to use that intimate form of you as well. So what's happening? If Warhol associates reader with irony and being playful and being metafictional, is that actually what these authors are doing? And for this, we have to close read. Oh, reader, can you imagine my joy? No, you cannot, unless you have been a slave mother. This is from Harriet Jacobs. Reader, did ever a fair sister of mine go down to the grave prematurely? If so, perchance thou hast drank deeply from the cup of sorrow. But how infinitely better is it for a sister to go into the silent land with her honor untarnished, but with bright hopes, than for her to be sold to sensuous slaveholders. So both of these authors are using the term reader, but it's not ironic, and it's not playful. It's sincere, and it's about real social issues. But unlike that sympathy that we see Stowe creating and that empathy that we see Upton Sinclair creating, these authors are saying that there might be a problem with empathy, because unless you have actually experienced being enslaved, you cannot know what that experience is like. So this is a curtailment of empathy. This is a problematizing of the idea of stepping into someone else's shoes when you haven't actually been there. In that case, we can kind of use reader as a distancing kind of device here. It's sincere, but it's kind of holding the reader at a distance, saying, no, you don't know what this experience is like, and it's a problem for you to think that you do. Okay. So before I go on to the Q&A and open things up for questions, I want to talk about some conclusions from these two studies overall. So if we return to that idea of the power grid versus the people on the individual streets, I think we can now see that there might be a different way of thinking about distance. It doesn't necessarily have to be this view from above. I think it's possible to think of distance as a type of defamiliarized perspective, a way to see things anew, to see things fresh that we might not notice because we've read something so many times, or we're used to reading canonical literature instead of non-canonical literature. So in both of these studies, using distant reading tools lets us look at passages and novels and perspectives that we might not typically notice, right? In that first gender verb study, we get to compare canonical and non-canonical works. In the address study, we get to see address from a new perspective. We get to pay attention to books that we might not normally think of as being about address. And it lets us sort of compare those individual moments, right, to the historical trajectory in this bigger picture. So I would argue that distant reading, which is something that we kind of see coming out of STEM, coming from computer science, is something that actually integrates with close reading. It's something that actually integrates with close reading really well, because close reading lets us see the nuance, but distant reading can guide us to where we want to look. Okay. Thank you very, very much for sticking around and listening. After you read this adorable little cartoon, I'm open to questions. And if you have anything, I'm happy to talk about digital humanities at large, how you get into work like this, if you're interested in it, what the DH scene looks like at TCU and in Fort Worth, so anything, really. Thank you.
I love Elephant and Piggy. I've got no questions, but I read that story to my daughter just the other night.
We just got it for our niece, so.
Gosh, it's such a good book.
I'm sorry, I came in late. What was your dissertation is in what field?
Oh, English.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And what's the name of it?
This reader is no fiction, examining the rhetorical usage of reader address in the 19th and 20th century novel.
Oh, there we go.
Now it sounds more Englishy.
Only one colon.
Only one colon, yeah.
So you may have already said, but how long did it take you to collect all this data and sort of analyze it and come to these conclusions?
That's a great question. So in both projects, the corpora, the group of texts, are already sort of out there. For this type of work, a lot of universities and a lot of scholars have already kind of put together these big collections of texts. So that in and of itself is not really a problem. Getting the data, right, so creating the program or the script is kind of the hard part. In the case of the gender study, it didn't really take that long. It was maybe working on it a month. And then most of it was kind of delving into it after we had the results. It took me 6 months, embarrassingly, to figure out how to deal with quotations. It probably took me 6 months to figure out all of the computational stuff that I did for my dissertation. Jason?
I won't accept that embarrassingly adverb because I just want to, it's the same question I asked a year ago when I saw you give a similar presentation. Nobody knew this before, right? This method you created to identify quotations.
It's true.
And it's useful for your purposes to eliminate quotations.
Right.
But it could also be useful for others
But it
to
is
identify
greedy.
dialogue.
It is greedy. That's the problem with this. Is a term from computer science. It's greedy. It's oriented towards getting rid of the quotations. You could slightly modify it to be used for gathering quotations, and to some extent that's an easier problem. But you would have to modify it a bit because it's greedy.
But you did embarrassingly create a brand new technique for DH for
I
identifying
think I
and
might
removing
have been the
quotations.
only person silly enough to tackle the quotation thing. Everyone else was like, no, I don't want to spend my nights thinking about quotation marks.
So I have three questions, and one is just a name that I missed at the beginning for trying to set this up. You mentioned an app on Google, and what was the name of that?
Oh, Google Ngram.
And,
Everybody should go home and play with Google Ngram.
all right, cool. I will be doing that.
And Voyant. Voyant. It lets you do word clouds and stuff.
Cool. And then I have two questions about the talk itself. One has to do with the word look in the use of 19th-century novel. So from what I got from your chart is that verbs related to men were about imposing themselves, whereas most verbs about women were about withdrawing. So like
Yes.
sitting down, sobbing, all that kind of stuff. And yet look, it's a power move, if you will. If you're familiar, like of course you are, like male gaze and all that stuff. So how did that happen?
Okay. So let's think about look. It can be used in two different ways, right? I can look at you, or I can be looked at,
Okay.
right? We don't know. The same with cry, right? You can cry as in to weep. You can also cry as in to cry out. And there's no way for the computer to distinguish between those things.
Okay.
So to some extent, it's a matter of, in English, word ambiguity. But there are some other words, and interestingly, as we move into the 20th century, and I can point you towards the study that kind of came after mine, some of the verbs associated with motion start to become associated with female characters. And some of the kind of more psychological verbs, feeling is associated with women in the 19th century, and then all of a sudden, feeling starts to be associated with men in the 20th century, which is an interesting and pretty quick transition. So some of those things really start to get a little bit messy around the turn of the century.
That's really cool. And then if I can ask about, unless anyone else has another question first, okay, go for it, and then we can come back to me.
The dates, it was around the Civil War, or was it before? What was the date range?
Which ones?
Just in general, the novels you studied?
Oh, both are from the ones from 1800 1900, the other ones from 1789 to 1923. So the Civil War's in there, but it's a broad swath of time.
Do you think that would influence the amount of male references?
Possibly. Yeah, because that's a really good question. This doesn't account for genre, right? And I mean, there are certain genres of books that I would expect to see more male characters and more actors in, and I think connecting it to action is definitely important, because if we have novels about the war, we are going to have male characters performing physical act. We're going to have a lot of riding. We're going to have a lot of running, right? So I think that coming out of the Civil War, authors who were writing about, and even before the Civil War, authors that were writing other military novels, which is a pretty popular 19th century genre, would kind of be linking male characters with that type of action. Thank you.
I think you may have answered the second question, but I just want to make sure. You said that genre isn't taken into account? Does that also include genre as in form? I'm thinking like 19th century novel, the use of you and addressing the reader. Epistolary was a really big thing. Now it's not. So
Yeah. This is a good question. I tried to get rid of the epistolary novels.
Okay.
I
Cool.
intentionally tried to just be, if I saw one, I got rid of it. That's why there's only 2,000. I started with 3,000,
Awesome.
and anything that was too many letters, I got rid of. I also wrote a script. It turned out I was shocked, disheartened, and surprised by how many novels that aren't epistolary novels still include at least 1 or 2 letters. Like every 19th century novel, as it turns out, has a letter in it, which is, for my purposes, extremely annoying because they didn't put any of them in quotes, they didn't indent them, they didn't italicize them. It's just like, wow, here's a letter. So I tried to write a script that would get rid of letters. It's hard because there's no uniform way of presenting a letter. It's it gets rid of some of them. It essentially looks for salutations and then gets rid of texts that contain salutation until the end of what looks like the letter. But not all letters contain salutations in the 19th century novel, so it's really messy. In terms of looking at genre, the first study, the gender one, it did look at genre. The original goal was to look at genre. That kind of fell apart because it's incredibly difficult to look at genre because most works participate in multiple genres in the 19th century. So when you're dealing with 200 books, you can kind of say, well, this is from this genre and that's from that genre based on scholarly consensus. But when you're working with 3,000 and there's no scholarly consensus, it's really hard to say, okay, well, this is a Gothic novel for sure, nothing else. So we kind of left genre by the wayside a little bit just because it's such a tricky problem. But there has been work that has done this kind of statistical modeling to predict genre. And that's actually been pretty successful, especially for things like the industrial novel and the Gothic novel.
Thanks.
Sure, thank you.
One more. Did you find that Welter's observation that women were the passive observers, men were the more active, was borne out too when you started looking at authorship? Did that
Good
serve
question.
true?
Okay, so shockingly, I was really expecting to see, okay, female authors are gonna rip Victorian society anyone. But it turns out that it doesn't. Author gender doesn't really matter. That it's about equivalent. There's a slight difference. Female authors are actually more likely to create stereotypical female characters. Male authors are slightly more likely to create stereotypical male characters. My reasoning behind this is that if you're forced to conform to a gender role your whole life, you have a good understanding of what that looks like. So female authors were probably more familiar with the conventions surrounding, female gender propriety, so they were able to kind of nail that stereotype in a way that male authors weren't quite, and vice versa. That's my hypothesis.
Prior to your dissertation, how much experience did you have with reading scripts and the technical ability to give, and how did you acquire that to do that kind of?
That's a really good question. So I was an English major. I got my MA in English, and I'm an English PhD. So I don't have any official degree in any sort of information science or in computer science. I started kind of learning some things about programming around my master's. I was partially self-taught, and I was partially very fortunate to end up in a PhD program that had a very, very, very strong emphasis on this kind of work. So I was able to take some classes, and I was able to be part of groups, part of a lab of people doing this type of work. But I think in general, it's pretty typical for people in my field to be self-taught. And it's pretty typical to just learn what you need to learn for what you're interested in. It's not like you have to have this huge repertoire of programming languages or computer science knowledge. People just become interested in a question, and they figure out whatever they need in order to answer that question. And there are a lot of resources online, and I'm certainly open to having one-on-one conversations if you're interested in something like that. But it's really achievable for someone who has a humanities background, if that helps. Sure.
Looking at books, a long time ago, pre-18th century,
Ooh, they had books.
pre-19th century. And you mentioned script. Is it certain letters? How do you know what the word is? Do you use
Yeah.
OCR, optical?
Yeah, character recognition.
Yeah. Is it descriptive?
Yeah.
similar to apps, for example?
So I don't work with text that old, but my understanding is that so when you OCR something, right, regardless of what era it's from, it's usually dirty anyway. And what's the accuracy rate? Like 70% or so. Usually if you want it to be a pretty clean text, you have to do hand correction. I'm pretty sure that people have created OCR scripts that will account for the FS issue, because it's just a matter of telling the computer when you see this symbol, you know, on the text or in the PDF, translate it to whatever character. And you have control over how you want to translate it. Things get really difficult when you go out of print and you go into manuscript studies, because if you start throwing handwriting in there, it just becomes impossible, right? You have to potentially have someone doing transcription, because OCR is just not going to cut it. Does that help? Kind of answer it? Okay.
And you're just dealing with English.
Oh, so what?
You're just dealing with English.
I'm just dealing with English, but a lot of people work with other languages because
It's a
of,
lot more complicated.
oh my goodness, yeah. Well, there are some languages though. I've talked about doing this type of project with someone. I know a little bit of Russian, so doing it with Russian and also doing it with Spanish, doing it with languages that actually have gender encoded into the language to a greater degree than English does. So in Russian, right, your verbs are gendered. So that makes things in a way a lot easier, right, and a lot more interesting. So looking at languages where gender plays a different role in the actual language itself. And there are people who are working, it's difficult, but I know that there are people who are working with Chinese and who are working with other Asian languages. I don't have a ton of experience, but there have been articles published on doing this type of work with other languages. So it's possible.
And some of the earliest DH work was in Greek and Latin.
Yeah, this is very true, coming out of kind of classics and rhetoric. Yeah.
Kind of bouncing off the languages idea in a different direction. You're mentioning different languages to speak. What about in terms of computers or C#? What?
Yeah. Most people in my field tend to use R or Python. I use R. It's a statistical programming language. Python, I don't know it. I want to learn it. I've heard that it's more accessible. Like I've heard if you want to pick up a first language, Python's actually easier to learn than R. But those are the two that people primarily work in for stuff like this. Good question.
Can you use the phrase natural language processing?
Natural language processing is awesome.
Just to set up my talk, since I'm going to talk about inform and then switch everything around.
Yeah, I mean, this is all machine learning and natural language processing.
Thank you.
It's machine learning and natural processing, natural language processing all the way down.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. Thank you.